April 5, 1945. The first light of dawn crept over the shattered hills of Okinawa, painting the jagged terrain in shades of ash and amber. Smoke rose from the ruins of farmhouses that had once stood in neat rows, their wooden frames splintered by artillery, their tiled roofs crushed under the weight of shell fire. For weeks, the island had echoed with the roar of mortars, the crash of naval barges, and the guttural cry of men fighting for every ridge and cave. But now, in this brief moment before the sun claimed the horizon, an eerie stillness had fallen. From the darkness of the pockmarked earth, weary figures began to emerge. American soldiers in mud-stained fatigues, their helmets tilted low, rifles slung carelessly over shoulders that sagged from exhaustion. Their boots crunched over gravel and broken glass as they gathered in a clearing, where a small field stove hissed with the smell of something no one expected to find in the middle of a battlefield. Pancakes. The men were gaunt, their eyes ringed with fatigue, but their hands moved with a strange ritual calm as they mixed powdered batter into dented tin bowls, poured it onto the sizzling griddle, and flipped golden circles of bread with bayonet tips. It was absurd, surreal even. In the middle of the Pacific's most brutal struggle, these soldiers had chosen to create something warm, something familiar. And from the edges of the clearing, hidden behind collapsed stone walls and camouflaged foxholes, frightened Japanese civilians watched in silence. Families who had survived weeks of bombardment, who had crouched in caves as flames rolled across the hillsides, now peered through smoke and rubble at their supposed enemy. They expected cruelty, expected indifference. What they saw instead was a quiet domestic scene. Young men laughing softly as they passed tin cups of coffee, steam curling upward like fragile prayers into the morning. Oh, the civilians. It was an image that defied reason. Propaganda had painted the Americans as demons, barbarians who killed without mercy, who desecrated homes and devoured villages. Yet here, as the sky blushed with sunrise, these foreign soldiers behaved like farmers at harvest, like fathers at a breakfast table long before the war had stripped such moments from Japanese life. One soldier broke a pancake in half, handing the larger piece to a comrade whose face was still streaked with dried blood. Another reached into a battered pack, pulled out a tin of syrup, and poured it carefully, as though every drop were treasure. From their hiding places, the civilians whispered in disbelief. Mothers held children close, eyes wide with confusion, trying to reconcile the stories of American savagery with the sight of men sharing food in silence. A boy, no older than 10, dared to crawl closer, drawn by the smell of frying batter. His mother hissed and clutched his sleeve, but hunger gnawed louder than fear. And then, one of the soldiers noticed. Slowly, deliberately, he crouched, broke off a corner of pancake, and placed it on a flat stone before retreating a step, hands raised in quiet reassurance. The boy froze, torn between instinct and longing, until finally he darted forward, snatched the bread, and retreated into the shadows. The taste, warm, sweet, utterly alien, would burn into his memory forever. For the Americans, it was a fleeting reprieve, a fragile attempt to remind themselves of home. They had fought through weeks of mud and blood, seen comrades fall under machine gun fire, and dragged wounded men through fields of shrapnel. In the chaos of Okinawa, where every cave might conceal an ambush and every farmer's hut could mask a trap, humanity was stripped to its core. Yet here, with pancakes and coffee, they created a moment of sanity. It was not victory, not strategy. It was survival of the spirit. For the civilians, the sight carried a different weight. It was not simply food. It was contradiction. These were the same soldiers whose artillery had shattered villages and whose bombers had turned the night sky into firestorms. Yet they were also men who laughed, who cooked, and who shared. The dissonance shattered the image carefully cultivated by years of government propaganda. In the silence of dawn, beneath the drifting smoke of Okinawa's hills, a truth flickered. The enemy was human. And yet, the fragility of this moment only sharpened the terror that still gripped the island. Because even as the soldiers ate, even as the civilians watched in disbelief, the rumble of distant artillery echoed from the ridges. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, Japanese soldiers prepared their defenses and American units tightened their advance. The war had not paused for breakfast. It was only a heartbeat of calm before the storm returned, but that heartbeat mattered. In those golden circles of batter, in the steam of boiled coffee, in the quiet laughter of men who might not live to see another dawn, something universal was revealed. The civilians could not believe it, yet they could not look away. The image burned itself into memory. At sunrise, in the middle of hell, enemies shared humanity, and Pancakes, by the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had reached its final, most desperate chapter. The Japanese Empire, stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, was battered on every front. From the jungles of Burma to the ruins of Manila, defeat pressed closer with every passing month. Yet nowhere did the struggle appear more ferocious, more absolute, than on the small island of Okinawa. Barely 60 miles long, it was a speck on the map, but its location, just 350 miles from the Japanese mainland, gave it staggering importance. For American planners, capturing Okinawa meant securing a staging ground for the invasion of Japan itself. For Tokyo, it meant the last shield before the home islands fell. Every inch of soil, every ridge and cave, would be contested with fanatic resolve. The battle opened on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, when over 60,000 Marines and soldiers stormed the Higuchi beaches. Under the thunder of the largest naval bombardment in history, waves of amphibious craft churned the sea, filling the horizon with steel. Offshore, more than 1,500 ships rained shells onto the shore, while aircraft from carriers screamed overhead in a sky thick with smoke trails. Yet, in a move that shocked many American commanders, the initial landings were met with eerie silence. Instead of facing entrenched resistance on the beaches, the invaders found empty shoreline. Villages stood abandoned, their walls scorched but deserted. The Japanese had withdrawn inland, preparing their defenses in depth among Okinawa's hills, caves, and labyrinthine ridges for the civilians trapped on the island. This strategy turned daily life into a nightmare. Okinawans were caught between two titans of war, both wielding overwhelming force. Japanese soldiers pressed families into service, demanding food, labor, and even children as messengers or lookouts. Propaganda insisted that death was preferable to surrender, whispering that Americans would slaughter or enslave anyone who fell into their hands. At the same time, American artillery and naval bombardments rained fire without distinction, obliterating villages, shrines, and fields. To survive meant burrowing into caves, living in darkness, and scavenging for scraps while the ground shook with constant thunder. Yet amidst this devastation, small human moments emerged, brief glimpses of an alternate reality. American soldiers, hardened by campaigns through Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, carried into Okinawa not just weapons but fragments of home. Their mess kits held powdered eggs, flour, and tins of coffee, small comforts shipped thousands of miles across the Pacific by a vast logistical machine. To the civilians, the very idea of such abundance was incomprehensible. After years of blockade and rationing, Japan's people were reduced to thin rice gruel, sweet potatoes, or whatever they could forage from ruined fields. And yet, on Okinawa, villagers hiding in rubble saw Americans cooking meals that felt like luxuries from another world that understand the impact of. These small acts, like sharing pancakes at sunrise, one must understand the cultural and psychological gulf between the two sides. For years, the Japanese government had painted Americans as monsters, subhuman invaders who would desecrate everything sacred. The Kempeitai, Japan's feared military police, spread rumors that surrender would mean mutilation, rape, and death. Civilians were handed grenades with instructions to kill themselves and their families rather than fall into enemy hands. Mothers were told to smother crying infants in caves to avoid giving away hiding places. Fear was weaponized, made into a shield for the Imperial Army. But when the Americans landed, many civilians found something unexpected. Yes, the firepower was merciless, the battles relentless. Yes, villages burned and neighbors died. Yet when civilians stumbled from caves, starved and trembling, some Americans offered water, rations, and even chocolate. These small gestures of humanity clashed violently with the propaganda machine. The pancakes at sunrise were not just breakfast. They were a revelation. They suggested that the enemy were not unfeeling minsters, but young men far from home, clinging to fragments of normal life in a world gone mad. Still, the broader context remained grim. Okinawa became a slaughterhouse. Nearly 180,000 Japanese soldiers defended the island, supported by Okinawan conscripts and terrified civilians pressed into service. Facing them were more than 500,000 American troops, backed by overwhelming naval and air power. The battle would last 82 days, grinding into the bloodiest confrontation of the Pacific War. Entire hillsides became fortresses, every cave a bunker, every ravine a killing ground. American troops advanced yard by yard, often at staggering cost. The 96th Infantry Division fought through the Shuri Line, a defensive system so formidable that even seasoned veterans described it as hell on earth. Marines clawed their way up Sugar Loaf Hill, where rain turned earth to mud and Japanese fire swept across every exposed inch. Amid this apocalyptic struggle, the civilians remained the silent victims. Nearly one-third of Okinawa's population would die before the battle ended, an estimated 100,000 souls. Families starved in caves, leapt from cliffs, or were caught in the crossfire. And yet, some survived because of fleeting moments of compassion, moments like that sunrise breakfast where Pancakes bridged the gulf between fear and recognition. To them, it was not strategy or doctrine that mattered, but the undeniable fact that the enemy had chosen to share rather than destroyed at as April turned to May. The contrast between brutality and humanity only deepened. Kamikaze planes hurled themselves at the American fleet offshore, sinking dozens of ships and killing thousands of sailors. Inland, Japanese defenders launched desperate night raids, slipping through lines to attack with bayonets and grenades. American soldiers responded with relentless artillery, flamethrowers, and demolition charges, scouring caves until nothing moved. But in the quiet hours between assaults, the soldiers still brewed coffee, wrote letters home, and cooked whatever scraps the supply lines delivered. Sometimes, civilians caught glimpses of these moments, and in those glimpses, doubt about the propaganda festered. For the Americans, these moments carried weight as well. Many had grown up on farms and in small towns, where breakfast was a ritual of family and comfort. To cook pancakes on a battlefield was to insist that they were still human, that war had not devoured everything. When a soldier offered a child food, he was not making a political statement. He was remembering his own little brother or sister, imagining their hunger, and responding instinctively. In this way, the small act of sharing breakfast became a profound contradiction in the midst of one of the deadliest battles of the century. The most ordinary gesture carried extraordinary meaning. The civilians watching could not have known the scope of the war, the grand strategy, or the calculations unfolding in Tokyo and Washington. But they understood hunger. They understood fear. And when they saw men who should have been their destroyers pause to eat, to share, to laugh, they began to sense a truth hidden beneath layers of lies. That moment, simple, fragile, and almost absurd, revealed that even in the heart of the Pacific's bloodiest battle, humanity flickered still. The revelation came slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet it carried the weight of a tectonic shift. For the Japanese civilians of Okinawa, conditioned by years of wartime propaganda, the image of American soldiers sharing food was a riddle with no answer. To them, the enemy had always been painted as a shadow of cruelty, a faceless horde of murderers, ready to annihilate all that was sacred. Yet here, in the dawn light, those same men passed steaming tin cups to one another, broke bread, and even offered scraps to starving children. It was not the Americans' weapons that unsettled them most in that moment, not the tanks grinding through villages or the planes tracing fire across the skies. It was their humanity. What civilians could not yet understand was that the Americans carried into battle an advantage as invisible as it was decisive. It was not simply industrial might, nor the ocean of resources flowing across the Pacific. It was communication, the unbroken thread of connection binding soldier to soldier, unit to unit, and even man to home. In the chaos of Okinawa, radios crackled day and night, guiding artillery strikes, directing supplies, and relaying orders with speed and clarity the Japanese defenders could scarcely imagine. While the Imperial Army relied on runners darting through smoke, vulnerable to every bullet, The Americans carried their voices across hills and ravines instantly. It was a hidden weapon, humming within the static, shaping the rhythm of the battle. The pancakes at sunrise, in truth, were a symptom of this unseen power. Logistics flowed with precision, trucks delivering not just ammunition and fuel but crates of flour, tins of syrup, and even coffee beans roasted in far-off American towns. Civilians hiding in caves could not fathom such abundance, but soldiers knew it was the byproduct of an empire of supply, orchestrated by radio signals bouncing across miles of terrain. When an infantry squad's rations ran low, a request was sent, and hours later fresh supplies appeared. It was as if the battlefield itself bent to the Americans' ability to coordinate, to synchronize, and to remain united under conditions where the Japanese often found themselves isolated and cut off. For the defenders, this contrast was maddening. Reports captured after the war revealed their disbelief. Japanese officers wrote of Americans who seemed to move with uncanny precision, who regrouped even after suffering losses, and who struck with timing that suggested some unnatural coordination. They could not see the invisible web of frequency modulation radios tying every squad into a living organism. They could only feel the effects: ambushes unraveling, counterattacks collapsing, and positions overrun before reinforcements could arrive. To them, it was a phantom advantage, a ghost that haunted every hillside. Civilians saw the consequences in quieter ways. They noticed that American patrols rarely seemed lost, that supplies flowed steadily, and that soldiers could linger long enough to cook and to share, even in the midst of chaos. For the Japanese garrisons, by contrast, hunger was constant. Soldiers scavenged rice from villages, stripped fields bare, and sometimes stole from the very civilians they claimed to protect. Fear was their only sustenance. This divide etched itself into the minds of those who witnessed it. One army bound by desperation, the other by connection. Yet the significance of these radios extended beyond supply and maneuver. They altered psychology. American soldiers felt less alone, their isolation pierced by the comforting hiss and crackle of a voice on the other end. A platoon pinned down by fire could call for artillery, and within minutes shells rained down to save them. A medic could summon evacuation for the wounded. A sergeant could receive orders even after his officer fell. This thread of communication was a lifeline, a reassurance that no man fought in silence. For the Japanese, silence was the rule. Units cut off in caves or tunnels often fought until annihilation, never knowing reinforcements were miles away, never realizing headquarters had already abandoned them. And so, when civilians peered from their hiding places at sunrise and saw Americans sharing pancakes, what they were truly seeing was the manifestation of this hidden edge. It was not about food. It was about the luxury of cohesion, the capacity to maintain fragments of home even in a world torn apart. The boy who tasted that foreign sweetness could not know he was tasting the product of a vast system humming behind the battlefield. Factories in Detroit, rail lines in Kansas, convoys across the Pacific, and radios guiding it all with tireless efficiency. But he felt its truth nonetheless. The Germans, fighting half a world away, had already learned to fear this same advantage. On the fields of France, they watched in bewilderment as American armor maneuvered with speed, as artillery struck targets with uncanny accuracy. They had tanks with thicker armor and guns with longer barrels, but they did not have the invisible threat. By the time Okinawa burned, the Japanese too had begun to feel its grip. Civilians, trapped between two worlds, saw not just destruction but the quiet echo of something that unsettled everything they had been taught: order amidst chaos, connection amidst ruin. The irony was brutal. For the Japanese government, civilians were pawns, their deaths wielded as propaganda, their loyalty demanded even as their lives were discarded. For the Americans, civilians were obstacles, potential threats, but also human beings to be managed, fed, and sometimes even protected. And in that fragile space where humanity slipped through, the unseen edge of American war-making revealed itself. It was a war not only of bullets and shells, but also of networks and voices, of unseen signals stitching the battlefield together like veins carrying lifeblood. On Okinawa, the pancakes at sunrise became a symbol of something larger than breakfast. To the civilians who could not believe their eyes, It was the first crack in the wall of lies. To the Japanese defenders, it was a reminder of what they lacked. A reminder that the enemy's strength was not only in steel and fire, but also in the ability to act as one. And to the Americans, it was proof that even in hell, connection could preserve a fragment of home. May 13th, 1945. The morning fog clung low over the ridges south of Shuri Castle, heavy with the smell of cordite and burned timber. Rain had turned foxholes into shallow graves filled with mud, and exhausted men crouched beneath ponchos, their rifles propped against sandbags slick with water. Along a narrow trail, a convoy of jeeps struggled uphill, their engines growling, tires slipping in the muck. Each vehicle carried precious cargo, not ammunition or explosives this time, but field radios, coiled antennas, crates of batteries, and the strange metallic lifelines that had already changed the rhythm of war. The SCR-508, a squat, rugged box of steel and glass, weighed nearly 200 pounds when fully equipped. Its dials glowed faintly, its tubes hummed with energy, and when switched on, it brought the invisible battlefield alive with voices. Static crackled, but within that static came clarity unknown to the Japanese defenders. A commander miles away could speak directly to tank crews rolling through ravines or to artillerymen crouched beside their howitzers. In a matter of seconds, an entire attack shifted course. To the Americans, this was no luxury. It was survival engineered into steel and wires. Each radio was a marvel of design, born from the workshops of Motorola and RCA, powered by thousands of components churned out on Detroit assembly lines. The SCR-508 delivered up to 25 watts of power, broadcasting across a range of 5 miles under battlefield conditions, more than double what many Japanese sets could achieve. Unlike the scratchy, unstable AM radios of their enemies, the American sets used frequency modulation. FM cut through the storm of interference that had plagued earlier campaigns. No longer did static drown out orders in the middle of artillery barrages. No longer did voices vanish when rain battered the jungle canopy. Clarity became a weapon in itself. For the Japanese, the difference was devastating. Their standard FUG and Type 94 radios were fragile, underpowered, and notoriously unreliable in tropical climates. Tubes burned out quickly, wires snapped, and even when they worked, their range was pitiful. Many units resorted to runners, boys carrying handwritten notes through shellfire, or field phones that required wires strung across shattered ground. In the chaos of Okinawa's hills, these systems failed again and again. By the time a message arrived, the situation had already shifted. Orders were outdated before they could even be read. To the defenders, it felt as though they were fighting blind. The Americans, meanwhile, fought with eyes open. A Sherman tank platoon cresting a ridge could radio back instantly for artillery cover. Infantry squads pinned by machine gun fire could summon smoke barges to shield their advance. Naval gunners offshore, sitting behind the steel walls of battleships, received precise coordinates and rained shells on hidden bunkers miles inland. The network stretched seamlessly from frontline foxholes to headquarters bunkers, from the smallest jeep-mounted set to the powerful transmitters aboard command ships. War became a web, and every thread pulsed with coordination. Numbers tell the story as much as images. By 1944, American factories were producing over 800,000 military radios a year. Motorola alone supplied tens of thousands of sets, their assembly lines humming day and night, staffed by women who soldered wires and tested circuits with the precision of surgeons. Every finished unit was packed, shipped, and loaded onto convoys bound for the Pacific. By contrast, Japanese industry, strangled by blockade and resource shortages, could scarcely keep pace. Their best radios were reserved for command units, leaving frontline troops to improvise. Civilians often saw soldiers tearing down telephone lines to strip copper for makeshift wiring, while American convoys rumbled past with crates of brand-new sets stacked like firewood. Yet the true significance of these machines was not technical, but human. Radios turned scattered squads into coordinated phalanxes. They allowed a wounded soldier, bleeding in the mud, to be heard by men he could not see. They gave commanders the confidence to launch maneuvers knowing support could be summoned instantly. They stitched the battlefield together into a single, living organism, And with every crackle of transmission, the psychological gap widened. Japanese soldiers, cut off, felt abandoned. They fought in silence, often unsure if higher command still lived, unsure if reinforcements would ever come. American soldiers, though equally terrified, could hear voices. A sergeant's calm order, an artilleryman's acknowledgement, and even the hiss of static between commands reminded them they were not alone. Morale bent, but did not break, because connection held. Civilians noticed too. They watched as Americans carried radios slung over shoulders like strange talismans, their antennas swaying above helmets. They saw men halt in the middle of fields, turn dials, murmur into microphones, and then move with purpose minutes later, as though guided by unseen eyes. To those hiding in caves, it looked like sorcery. How else could an army summon fire from the sea or deliver trucks of supplies to places where none should reach? The pancakes at sunrise and the coffee steaming in tin mugs were the surface signs of this hidden sorcery. Radios made them possible. Radios made them inevitable. Inventors like Daniel E. Noble, the engineer behind Motorola's FM radio systems, would never set foot on Okinawa. Yet their fingerprints lay across every ridge, every cave cleared, every civilian spared or destroyed. In their labs, thousands of miles from the mud and smoke, they had forged a weapon as decisive as any rifle or cannon, the ability to speak clearly when it mattered most. And in war, clarity was life. To the Americans who cooked breakfast at dawn, these radios were invisible companions. They ensured that supplies reached the front in time and that units knew when to rest, when to push, and when to brace for counterattack. To the civilians watching from shadows, the pancakes symbolized an alien abundance. But beneath the smell of syrup and flour, the true message was carried on invisible waves. This army is connected, and connection is strength. September 18, 1944. The rolling hills of Lorraine lay shrouded in mist, their fields scarred by weeks of fighting. Near the small village of Ericourt, morning light revealed a battlefield littered with burned-out hulks of armor, blackened panthers. Their guns twisted skyward, and Shermans still smoldering from the night's duels. The German 11th Panzer Division, veterans of the Eastern Front, had expected to crush the Americans with superior tanks. On paper, their Panthers outclassed anything the enemy could field. Thicker armor, more powerful guns, longer range. The mathematics of war seemed undeniable. Yet by the end of the day, German crews spoke of ghosts, of tanks that struck from nowhere, vanished into the fog, and coordinated with a precision they could not match. Those ghosts were American units woven together by the invisible thread of radio. From the first clash, the imbalance became clear. As dawn broke, German tanks advanced in tight wedges, their commanders straining through periscopes, trying to locate the enemy. But the fog was thick, muffling sound and obscuring vision. Panther gunners fired blind, shells tearing through hedgerows and farmhouses. Then, without warning, a salvo of American artillery rained down from beyond the horizon. Shells bracketed the German advance with terrifying accuracy, forcing crews to scatter. How had the Americans known? The answer whispered through the static of SCR 300 backpack radios carried by forward observers hidden in the mist. They had watched and reported, and seconds later, steel had answered. When American armor struck back, it did so with speed that defied expectation. Sherman tanks darted in and out of fog banks, striking at flanks, retreating before Panthers could traverse their turrets. To German crews, it seemed chaotic and undisciplined, yet patterns soon emerged. A Sherman pinned one flank while another maneuvered. Infantry moved in tandem, artillery shifted focus, and aircraft swooped overhead just as German counterattacks massed. What looked like improvisation was in fact orchestration, guided by constant radio chatter stitching every move into a larger rhythm. One Panther commander, interviewed after the war, described the frustration with disbelief. We fired at shadows. When we turned, they were gone. Then fire fell from behind us, as though they could see everything. Our own radios. Useless. Silence. Confusion. For German troops, silence became a weapon used against them. Their commanders relied on prearranged signals, flares, or dispatch riders who often never returned. The Americans, by contrast, adapted in real time. When a Sherman platoon commander was killed, Another voice instantly assumed control over the net. No gap, no hesitation. The fight continued seamlessly. The battle raged for days. At Ericourt alone, 39 German tanks were destroyed. American losses were heavy too, but the pattern was undeniable. Coordination defeated superiority. German crews reported being outmaneuvered by tanks they considered inferior. Their intelligence officers noted with alarm that American artillery and armor moved like extensions of the same body. They could not grasp that the secret lay not in the machines themselves, but in the radios humming inside each one. Back on Okinawa, civilians watching the Americans share pancakes at sunrise could not know of Ericourt or the fields of Lorraine. Yet the same principle guided both moments. The pancakes symbolized abundance and unity. Ericourt demonstrated the battlefield expression of that unity. Radios made both possible. The same logistical web that ensured flour and coffee reached the Pacific Front also ensured artillery shells reached Lorraine in time to shatter a German assault. The same voices that coordinated breakfast convoys coordinated tank maneuvers across foggy fields. Reports captured from German units after Ericourt revealed their growing awareness. The enemy reacts too quickly, one officer wrote. Before we finish an order, they have already changed their attack. Another noted bitterly. Their radios give them eyes we do not have. This was not simply a matter of frustration. It was demoralization. German tankers entered combat knowing their armor was superior, only to watch battles slip away because their opponents could communicate in ways they could not counter. The kill ratios told the same story. In some clashes, Shermans destroyed multiple Panthers for every loss they sustained, not because of thicker armor or bigger guns, but because of coordination. Artillery arrived when needed, infantry appeared at the right moment, and airstrikes punctured momentum before it could build. The battlefield became a stage, and the Americans, through radio, held the script. The Germans improvised blindly. Civilians on Okinawa saw echoes of this orchestration without realizing it. When convoys arrived precisely, when artillery fell just as Americans advanced, when supplies appeared in the middle of blasted landscapes, these were the fingerprints of the same advantage. To them, it was bewildering, sometimes terrifying. But to the soldiers, it was the difference between chaos and control, between life and annihilation. By the time the smoke cleared at Ericourt, the myth of German invincibility in armored warfare had been punctured. For the first time, seasoned Panzer veterans admitted they had been outfought not by technology, but by something invisible. In the East, they had faced Soviet numbers. In the West, they now faced American radios. The lesson would echo across every battlefield that followed. On Okinawa, the civilians watching sunrise pancakes still struggled to believe what they saw. But in Europe, the Germans already knew. The American secret was not just firepower. It was the voice carried on the ether, the unseen advantage that made ordinary men appear like phantoms on the battlefield. Late 1944. Deep inside Germany, the mood within Hitler's high command shifted from arrogance to unease. Reports arriving from the Western Front painted a picture that defied their expectations. Panther crews spoke of confusion, of being struck from directions they never anticipated, of enemy tanks appearing as if guided by some unseen hand. At first, the generals dismissed these accounts as excuses from shaken men. But as the months passed, the pattern grew undeniable. Time and again, American forces with inferior tanks and fewer guns managed to outmaneuver German units. The key, whispered in after-action reports and confirmed through captured equipment, was radio. Not simply possession of it, but mastery of its use. Inside bunkers in Berlin and command posts along the Siegfried Line, German officers pored over intercepted American chatter. What they found shocked them. American divisions communicated with an ease that seemed impossible. Every tank, every platoon, and every artillery observer carried a voice into the ether. Orders were short, precise, and constant. The battlefield was alive with invisible lines binding every unit together. Compared to this, German forces seemed mute. Their radios were limited, their doctrine centralized, and their flexibility crippled. Even when they captured American sets, they could not replicate the system because they lacked the structure and training to exploit it. One Wehrmacht officer later confessed. It was as if every American soldier had a telephone line directly to his commander. We had to wait for couriers, for messengers on motorcycles who often never returned. They had answers before we had even asked the question. In the Ardennes, this disparity became catastrophic. As Hitler launched his desperate counteroffensive in December, fog and snow blanketed the forest, grounding Allied aircraft and giving the Germans their last chance. Panzer divisions surged forward, their initial breakthroughs shocking American lines. But once again, radios turned the tide. American units that should have been overwhelmed reorganized in real time. Cut-off companies held crossroads because reinforcements were already on the way, guided by constant communication. Artillery blanketed advancing columns, summoned by observers hidden in forests. By the time the skies cleared and Allied aircraft returned, the German offensive had already begun to unravel. Hitler had counted on confusion, on the paralysis of his enemy in the face of surprise. Instead, he encountered an adversary that could adapt within minutes. His armies, bound to rigid orders issued hours before, moved like relics of an older war. On Okinawa, far from the snow-choked Ardennes, civilians who watched American logistics unfold could not know the connection. But the same system that allowed a platoon in Belgium to request artillery in minutes was the system that ensured flour and sugar reached a field kitchen in the Pacific. Radios and supply chains were two faces of the same coin: coordination. To civilians, it looked like abundance without explanation. To German commanders, it looked like a nightmare without weakness. As 1945 dawned, the Reich reeled from blows on both fronts. In the East, Soviet numbers pressed relentlessly. In the West, American precision ground them down. German officers began openly admitting that they had underestimated their enemy. The myth of American softness, of a nation too reliant on machines, was shattered. Instead, they found a force that turned its machines into extensions of its will. Linked by the simplest but most decisive of tools, the radio, when interrogated after surrender, captured German generals spoke with grudging respect. "We could not match their flexibility," one admitted. "They fought like a body with 1,000 eyes and 1,000 ears. We were blind and deaf in comparison." Another reflected bitterly. "Our panzers were lions. Their Shermans were sheepdogs." But sheepdogs guided by radio can bring down lions. In Okinawa's villages, those words had no echo. For the people there, what they saw each morning was a different kind of miracle: pancakes, coffee, laughter, and the strange normalcy of men at war who seemed untouched by hunger or uncertainty. But beneath the surface, it was the same miracle described by defeated German generals: connection, communication, and coordination. Radios did not just change battles. They changed how the enemy perceived the very possibility of victory. By spring of 1945, the Reich was collapsing. In Berlin, orders still flowed from Hitler's bunker, but they arrived late, often meaningless, and disconnected from reality. In contrast, American field commanders adjusted by the hour, sometimes by the minute, radios crackling with updates. One system represented rigidity. The other represented adaptation. The outcome was inevitable. Okinawa braced for its final ordeal. As Europe shuddered through its last winter of war, one truth had become clear across both hemispheres. The United States had found an advantage invisible yet overwhelming. Tanks, guns, planes, and men mattered, but radios made them one. Where the Axis fought as fragments, the Allies fought as a whole. And in that difference lay the fate of empires. Dawn, April 1st, 1945. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War surged toward Okinawa. More than 1,300 American ships dotted the horizon, their decks bristling with Marines, soldiers, and supplies. Offshore, the thunder of naval guns shook the earth, pulverizing ridgelines and villages in preparation for landings. Smoke rolled inland, blotting out the rising sun. Civilians huddled in caves and shelters, praying as the island trembled under the weight of a modern army descending upon them. For the Japanese defenders, this was the decisive battle to halt the American tide. For the civilians, it was the end of their world. Yet amid the chaos, the quiet rituals of American soldiers would leave impressions that seemed utterly alien to those trapped on the island. By this stage of the war, American operations were defined not only by overwhelming firepower, but also by an unprecedented ability to sustain men under fire. Field kitchens were established within hours of landings. Convoys of trucks brought flour, canned goods, and fresh rations across terrain still contested by Japanese defenders. To civilians, starving after years of blockade, the sight of soldiers flipping pancakes at sunrise seemed impossible, almost surreal. They whispered among themselves. How could men at war eat as if they were at home? This was not coincidence, nor indulgence. It was doctrine. American commanders believed morale was as vital as ammunition. A soldier who felt connected to home, who tasted coffee or smelled butter frying in the pan, fought with greater endurance. Thus, logistics was weaponized. Every crate of food that landed on Okinawa was part of the same system that carried artillery shells and medical supplies. And radios ensured its efficiency. Convoys rerouted around ambushes. Field kitchens shifted forward in step with the infantry. Nothing, not even breakfast, was left to chance. For Japanese civilians, indoctrinated to see the Americans as barbaric invaders, these scenes created deep confusion. They had been told the enemy was ruthless, inhuman, a beast that devoured and destroyed. Instead, they saw boys barely older than their sons laughing over pancakes, sharing syrup from tins, and offering bites to children who dared creep from hiding. Some civilians refused to believe it, convinced it was a trick. Others accepted cautiously, torn between fear and hunger. A farmer's wife later recalled, "I thought they would kill us, but they gave my children food. I could not understand it." Meanwhile, the Japanese military watched the same phenomenon with a different kind of disbelief. They saw in those pancakes not kindness, but terrifying proof of American abundance. Their own soldiers fought on empty stomachs, sustained by rice balls or nothing at all. Logistics on Okinawa were collapsing. With supply lines severed by naval bombardment, Japanese troops relied on foraging, even stripping bark from trees. To them, the smell of American pancakes was an insult, a reminder that the enemy could fight and feast at once. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary before his death, "They eat like kings in the middle of battle. We eat grass. How can we prevail?" The psychological toll was immense. Every morning, the crackle of American radios ensured breakfast arrived where it was needed. Every evening, Japanese soldiers dug deeper into starvation. Civilians caught between the two sides drew their own conclusions. The American war machine was not only relentless in firepower but also self-sustaining in ways the Japanese could not fathom. In an empire where scarcity had become normal, abundance itself became a weapon. On the front lines, radios orchestrated this rhythm. A platoon pinned down on a hillside could request artillery within minutes. Then, once the ground was secured, call for rations and hot meals. The same system that guided destroyers' guns could guide a truckload of flour. For American soldiers, it was proof that they were never abandoned, never isolated. For Japanese soldiers, cut off from commanders and starved of supplies, it was proof that the battle was unwinnable. The civilians who crept out at dawn to glimpse the invaders saw only fragments, a tin of coffee, a stack of pancakes, and a smile from a boy carrying a bow-tie rifle and a frying pan. But those fragments spoke louder than propaganda. They hinted at an enemy both human and impossibly strong. An enemy who could feed his men and still bring the full fury of modern war upon their homeland. For the men flipping pancakes on Okinawa's beaches, the act may have seemed ordinary. For the civilians who watched, it was extraordinary. It was a vision of a power so great it could blend war and peace in the same breath. A rifle leaning against a mess kit, a helmet resting beside a frying pan. Death and life woven together in a single sunrise. The spring of 1945 marked the unraveling of Japan's final defense. Okinawa became a graveyard of soldiers and civilians alike, but also a stage upon which the psychological collapse of the Japanese war effort played out in ways as subtle as they were devastating. By then, the Imperial Japanese Army had been battered by years of relentless combat. Starvation stalked its ranks, ammunition dwindled, and faith in ultimate victory, once unshakable, wavered under the weight of reality. Yet for civilians, the moment of collapse was measured not only in bombs and bullets, but also in contrasts so jarring they shattered belief. The Japanese soldier, gaunt and weary, carried the marks of deprivation. His uniform was threadbare, and his rations were meager, often no more than a handful of rice mixed with millet or even shavings of tree bark. Civilians who sheltered in caves with them shared the same hunger. They lived on roots, on scraps, on whatever could be found in the ruined countryside. Into this landscape of scarcity marched Americans whose supplies seemed limitless. Where one side survived on desperation, the other carried not just weapons but abundance. It was this disparity, more than any single weapon, that etched despair into Japanese hearts. Every morning, radios carried American orders across the island. They linked artillery batteries with infantry squads and field kitchens with frontline outposts. The sound of engines followed, the rumble of trucks delivering food and fuel, the whir of bulldozers carving airstrips from coral. To the Japanese, who had been taught that the Americans were weak, decadent, and unable to endure hardship, it was a revelation. Here was an enemy whose very decadence made him stronger. A soldier could fight longer, march farther, and shoot straighter because his belly was full. Civilians who witnessed Americans share pancakes with their own men and sometimes even with children understood instinctively. This was a war Japan could not win. Psychologists who later studied the war described morale as a fragile currency. The Americans, through radio and supply, minted it daily. German commanders on the Western Front had already admitted the same, noting how American flexibility and abundance wore down their seasoned divisions. On Okinawa, Japanese morale was eroded not just by shells, but by silence, silent radios, empty kitchens, and promises of reinforcement that never came. Soldiers who once swore to fight to the death now saw death less as honor than inevitability. The psychological impact on civilians was more complex. Years of propaganda had told them to expect savagery. Instead, they saw an enemy who fought ferociously yet still paused to eat, to laugh, and to share. For many, this created unbearable dissonance. Could the stories of American cruelty be lies? Could survival mean surrender? The Imperial Army insisted otherwise, threatening execution for those who wavered. But each sunrise meal the civilians witnessed chipped away at their fear. In some villages, mothers began pushing their children toward American lines, gambling on mercy rather than starvation. Japanese commanders noted the crumbling will of their troops and the shifting perception of their people. Reports from the front were grim. Units dissolving into chaos when radios failed, men choosing suicide over starvation, and civilians surrendering rather than hiding. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed unbreakable. Not because they were invincible in battle, many died each day, but because their system ensured the survivors carried on, fed and supplied, never abandoned. One Marine later recalled. We'd move up under fire, dig in, and before the next dawn, coffee and flapjacks would find us. It made you believe we could keep going forever. Japanese prisoners of war, hearing such testimonies, were stunned. For them, the concept of being supplied in the midst of battle was inconceivable. They had been trained to endure hunger as proof of loyalty. The Americans saw hunger as a liability, a weakness that could be eliminated through planning and coordination. WWII. As the battle reached its bloodiest phase, this contrast became decisive. Japanese resistance remained fierce, but desperation undercut its effectiveness. Civilians, once indoctrinated to fear the Americans more than death, now measured survival differently. Some hid less, others surrendered quietly, and a few even guided Americans through dangerous terrain. The myth of invincible Japanese spirit faltered when faced with the practical reality of American pancakes and coffee steaming in the morning air for the Japanese war effort. The greatest defeat was not only physical but also mental. Abundance itself became a weapon, as powerful as naval guns or Sherman tanks. Every pancake shared at sunrise was a reminder of America's industrial might, its organizational genius, and its ability to turn distant factories into warm meals thousands of miles away. Every Japanese soldier who smelled that food while his stomach ached carried the weight of a silent truth. He was fighting a war already lost. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced an end to the Pacific War, the survivors of Okinawa carried memories shaped as much by moments of bewilderment as by the roar of artillery. Among them was the enduring image of American soldiers gathering at dawn, rifles slung over their shoulders, mess kits in hand, waiting for pancakes on a battlefield where death was never far away. For Japanese civilians, That memory became a symbol of defeat, of survival, and of a new world order that would rise from the ashes of the old. The legacy of pancakes at sunrise was not about food alone. It was about what they represented. For the Americans, those meals were the product of logistics, of radios, and of a doctrine that saw morale as vital as bullets. For the Japanese, they were a revelation. The enemy's strength did not rest solely in his weapons, but in his ability to connect, to coordinate, and to sustain. This lesson echoed across both oceans. In Europe, German generals admitted with grudging respect that their own radios and supply chains could not match America's. In the Pacific, Japanese commanders saw their men reduced to starvation while their enemy feasted and fought with equal vigor. As the United States transitioned from war to occupation, the same systems that delivered pancakes on the front lines began to rebuild shattered nations. Radios that once guided artillery now carried news of surrender and peace. Supply lines that once hauled rations to foxholes now ferried flour and medicine to civilian populations. What had been weapons of war became tools of reconstruction. To many Japanese civilians, the first taste of American food in peacetime was inseparable from their memory of those surreal battlefield breakfasts. For military historians, the lesson of Okinawa and beyond was clear. Wars are not won by machines alone, but by networks of communication, of supply, of human connection. A tank without fuel, a rifle without bullets, and a soldier without food are nothing, but a force that can feed its men while under fire, that can shift strategy through a single radio call, that can sustain morale with the comfort of home even in hell. That is a force that can endure any trial that in the decades that followed. This principle defined American warfare. During the Cold War, the U.S. military built doctrines of network-centric operations, linking satellites, aircraft, and ground forces into webs of information that dwarfed anything conceived in World War II. In Vietnam, helicopters carried hot meals and supplies into jungles as surely as they carried ammunition. In the Gulf War of 1991, radio's descendants, digital communication networks, allowed coalition forces to coordinate with such speed and precision that an entire Iraqi army was dismantled in days. And in every campaign, the echoes of World War II remained. Connection outweighed isolation, and morale was as decisive as firepower for those who had lived through Okinawa. However, the lesson was far more personal. Survivors remembered how hunger had defined their existence, how propaganda had promised them only death or dishonor, and how the sight of an enemy soldier flipping pancakes at dawn had upended everything they thought they knew. For some, it was the first moment they imagined surrender as survival. For others, it was the bitter acknowledgement that their empire could never match such abundance. For children who tasted those pancakes, it was the beginning of a lifelong memory that war could be cruel yet strangely human. Even in Germany, far from the Pacific, captured officers admitted that America's strength was not merely in production numbers. "You built armies that spoke to each other," one general said after the war. "We built machines. You built connections." It was a statement as much about philosophy as about hardware. The Americans had turned logistics into a weapon, had made communication their greatest advantage, and had used both not only to destroy but also to rebuild. The final lesson of World War II, etched in blood and smoke across continents, was simple yet profound. In modern war, connection defeats isolation, abundance defeats scarcity, and humanity, expressed even in something as small as a shared pancake, can break through the walls of propaganda and fear that on Okinawa's shores. The smell of pancakes once drifted over the cries of battle. To those who remember, it remains an enduring paradox that in the midst of the most brutal conflict in history, the most powerful message was not only carried by bombs or bullets, but also by the quiet clatter of pans at sunrise. And from that paradox emerged a truth that shaped the world thereafter. Wars are won not just with steel and fire, but with the invisible threads that bind men together, even at the edge of destruction.